The geopolitical landscape? Absolutely chaotic. We're talking full-scale sanction wars, bombed nuclear facilities, and thousands of people protesting in the streets. It's a massive, high-stakes crisis. But here's the thing. To really grasp the headlines we're seeing right now, we can't just look at what happened yesterday. We gotta go way back. So in this explainer, we're gonna act as your definitive guide to figure out exactly how we got here. We'll be breaking down this incredibly complex, multi-generational action and reaction cycle between the United States and Iran.
Okay, let's dive into this. Look at the last 73 years. The US and Iran have had, well, a rocky relationship, to put it mildly. I mean, the United States has spent over 4.5 decades sanctioning Iran, basically treating the country like an arch-nemesis. But why? When did America's obsession with Iran actually start? To get that answer, we need to strip away the modern political rhetoric, look past the current administrations, and zoom all the way back to the world as it was in the early 1950s.
To keep things clean and totally impartial, here's our roadmap for demystifying this huge chunk of history. We'll start with the battle for oil, move into the era of coups and puppet kings, unpack the 1979 revolution, look at the modern nuclear tug-of-war, and finally, break down the two totally different perspectives, keeping this loop spinning.
All right, part one, the battle for oil.
It's absolutely crucial to note right off the bat that the roots of this whole conflict, they weren't about religion, they weren't about terrorism. It was all about natural resources. 1950s Iran was a vibrant, progressive place. Women were attending universities, they held real elections. Honestly, it wasn't a country that needed saving. But it did have one thing that made it simultaneously the luckiest and unluckiest nation on earth. Massive, massive oil reserves. Alongside the US, Russia, and Venezuela, Iran was a top-tier global oil producer. And you better believe that caught the undivided attention of the British Empire.
Now, what's really interesting about this data is the stark financial reality behind it. The British Royal Navy essentially ran on Iranian oil. But look at the revenue split between 1914 and 1950. The British government raked in nearly £91 million in corporate taxes, while the Iranian government got just over $35 million. That is a huge structural disparity. Post-World War II, nationalism was spreading like wildfire across the globe, and Iranians wanted control of their own economy. So, in 1951, they democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh. He was a fiercely nationalist, Western-educated lawyer, and his number one mandate? Nationalize Iran's oil.
Moving on to part two, coups and puppet kings.
So, Mossadegh nationalizes the oil, and Britain flat out panics. After their naval blockades fail to crush Iran, they go to the US for help. President Harry Truman actually shoots them down. He thought Iran's nationalization was totally fair. But then Dwight Eisenhower takes office. Britain gets smart and changes their pitch from, "we want our oil back," to, "hey, there's a serious communist threat here." Convinced Iran might fall to the Soviets, the US launches Operation Ajax. August 1953. CIA officers literally show up in Tehran with suitcases full of cash. They bribe newspaper editors, they recruit street thugs to start riots, they even hire people to just pretend to be communists. And the crazy part? It works. Street violence erupts, tanks roll in, and around 300 people lose their lives. Iran's democracy collapses. Mossadegh gets locked up, and the US helps install a pro-Western monarch, the Shah.
For Washington, this felt like a massive geopolitical home run. They secured a crucial ally in the Middle East. But for everyday Iranians, the Shah was just a puppet. He lived in this absurd, unimaginable luxury while regular people struggled. And his 25-year reign was backed up by SAVAK. This was his brutal secret police force, actually trained by the CIA, and they were used to imprison, torture, and execute thousands of political opponents. So for a quarter of a century, you have this deep, festering resentment just boiling up against the Shah and his Western backers.
Which brings us to part three, revolution and retaliation.
By 1979, the Iranian people hit their absolute breaking point. The historical pendulum swung back, and it swung hard. Millions poured into the streets demanding the Shah step down. And when the government responded by massacring protesters, the whole situation boiled over. The Shah was forced to flee the country, eventually heading to the US for cancer treatment. In his place, Ayatollah Khomeini, a religious leader who had been in exile, steps in. Practically overnight, Iran flips from a pro-Western monarchy into a strict anti-Western theocracy.
So the crucial point here is that number, 444. See, when the ousted Shah went to America for medical care, Iranians completely panicked. To them, this looked exactly like the 1953 playbook all over again, absolute proof the CIA was plotting to put him right back on the throne. In retaliation, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. Now, from the American perspective, this was a shocking act of lawless terrorism. But from the Iranian perspective, they felt they were just neutralizing a CIA command post. It deeply humiliated the U.S., wrecked Jimmy Carter's presidency, and permanently severed diplomatic ties.
The U.S. was furious and wanted retaliation for the hostage crisis. They found their proxy right next door, in Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein. When Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, sparking this horrific 8-year war, the U.S. quietly funneled massive support to Saddam. We're talking satellite intelligence, combat helicopters, dual-use tech, and, incredibly, Washington turned a blind eye when Iraq deployed chemical weapons against Iranian troops. For Iranians, the takeaway was crystal clear. American foreign policy had absolutely nothing to do with human rights. It was entirely about maintaining dominance and crushing Iran at all costs.
Part 4. The Nuclear Tug-of-War.
That devastating war in the 80s eventually ended, but the bad blood definitely didn't. Moving into the modern era, the battleground just shifted. We went from oil fields to uranium enrichment facilities. Now, Iran has always claimed its nuclear program is strictly for peaceful civilian energy, but Washington and Israeli intelligence, they saw a completely different picture. The Middle East basically runs on deterrence. If Iran actually acquired a nuke, the U.S. feared it would act as an unbreakable shield for proxy militias, like Hezbollah. It would directly threaten Israel, probably spark a massive arms race with Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and ultimately threaten the entire global petrodollar system.
That overwhelming fear kicked off an endless cycle of economic warfare. In 2015, we actually saw a brief glimmer of hope. The Obama administration brokered the JCPOA, that landmark deal where Iran agreed to dismantle its nuclear infrastructure in exchange for lifting sanctions. And honestly, it briefly worked. But then in 2018, the Trump administration pulled out, slapping over 1,500 new sanctions back on Iran to try and collapse its economy. In retaliation, Iran ramped right back up, enriching uranium closer and closer to weapons grade. And that rapid escalation, it brings us right back to the chaotic 2026 reality we talked about at the start, maximum U.S. pressure meeting a very real nuclear breakout risk.
Finally, Part 5. 2 perspectives, 1 loop. We've just traced 73 years of history together, going from oil rights to nuclear threats. But here is the absolute tragedy of this whole geopolitical standoff. Neither side thinks they're the villain. From Washington's perspective, they aren't holding some petty 73-year grudge. They're trying to contain a dangerous, terror-funding theocracy that destabilizes the region and risks a nuclear disaster. But from Tehran's perspective, they're simply defending themselves against an imperialist superpower that overthrew their democracy back in '53, propped up a dictator for decades, armed Saddam Hussein with chemical weapons, and has spent years trying to literally starve their economy into submission. It's just action and reaction.
Yet while these governments are completely locked in this endless ideological war, let's talk about the true victims here. It's the millions of ordinary Iranian civilians stuck right in the middle. These are everyday people who just want economic opportunity, safety, a normal life. Instead, they're getting crushed from above by the sheer brutality of their own authoritarian regime and simultaneously squeezed from the outside by decades of targeted, crippling American sanctions. So, we're wrapping up our explainer today with this final thought. 1953 triggered 1979. 1979 triggered the proxy wars of the 1980s. And those tensions just snowballed straight into the nuclear and sanction crises shaking the globe right now. It's this unbroken 73-year chain of retaliation. So the big question is, until one side is willing to finally put down its historical grievances and truly break the cycle, are we just going to be stuck in this exact same dangerous loop forever? Thanks so much for exploring this history with us today.